She tried to stop me from fishing in my own lake, until her reckless plan threatened the entire town's water supply. The lake behind my house had always been a sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the outside world faded into the gentle ripples of water lapping against the wooden dock. Every morning, I rose before the sun, carrying my fishing rod and a small tackle box filled with carefully organized lures, hooks, and bait. The walk to the lake was peaceful, lined with tall trees whose leaves whispered softly in the breeze, the air scented with the freshness of dew and the faint perfume of blooming wildflowers. As I settled on the edge of the dock, I could hear the quiet symphony of nature, the rhythmic splash of water, the distant croak of frogs, and the occasional caw of a solitary crow perched on a nearby branch. The sunrise gradually painted the sky in hues of amber, gold, and soft pink, and the reflection on the water was so perfect it seemed almost unreal, like a painting come to life. I cast my line, letting it drift lazily into the water, and for those hours, nothing else existed but the serene rhythm of the lake and the patient hope of a fish tugging at the line. Children from neighboring houses would sometimes run along the shoreline, their laughter echoing across the water, blending harmoniously with the soft quacks of ducks gliding in small clusters, dipping their heads beneath the surface in search of breakfast. Occasionally, a heron would sweep across the sky, wings outstretched, landing with grace along the far edge of the lake. The whole scene was a delicate balance, a perfect coexistence of life that felt timeless, a world where one could forget the troubles of deadlines, phone calls, and endless noise. Yet as perfect as this peace seemed, it was not universal. Not everyone in the neighborhood shared my appreciation for the calm simplicity of lakeside life. Karen, a longtime resident and an unusually assertive member of the HOA, had taken it upon herself to enforce her own peculiar standards of order and propriety. She was a tall woman, with sharp features and eyes that seemed perpetually narrowed, as though scanning for the slightest infraction in her surroundings. Karen's idea of community well-being often bordered on obsessive, and anyone deviating from her rigid sense of etiquette drew her attention, and frequently her displeasure. My fishing routine, innocent and tranquil as it was, had become a personal affront in her eyes. She often muttered about disturbances to the neighborhood's image, as if my early morning solitude and quiet enjoyment were crimes against civility. I first noticed her disapproval months ago when I saw her standing across the lake, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me while I cast my line. She wasn't hiding, nor was she attempting subtlety. It was a direct and pointed stare, sharp enough to cut through the morning mist. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. After all, I had lived here long enough to know that people sometimes misread harmless behaviors as provocations. Yet the disapproving visits became frequent, each time more intrusive than the last. Karen would find any reason to approach the dock, often under the guise of checking on safety or ensuring compliance with HOA regulations. But the undertone was clear. She considered my presence a nuisance. Once, she stopped by with a clipboard, ostensibly performing a routine survey of the lakeside. She meticulously scrutinized my fishing rod, my tackle box, even the way I had arranged my chair. She made a series of notes, all delivered in that infuriatingly condescending tone, and concluded with a pointed, "We must maintain the community's image after all." I smiled politely, thanked her for her concern, and went back to watching the water, but the satisfaction was fleeting. I realized then that this wasn't about rules or regulations. It was about control. Karen wanted to dictate how others experienced their lives, to impose her vision of perfection on a world that was none of her business. Still, the lake remained a haven, and I refused to let her interference spoil it. I adjusted my chair, cast my line once more, and breathed deeply, taking in the crisp morning air as if it were armor against irritation. The ducks continued their quiet ballet across the lake, and the children's laughter remained a soothing counterpoint to the tension she brought with her presence. Even when Karen escalated her tactics, filing complaints about noise disturbances that were laughably unfounded, I maintained my composure, understanding that this was less about me and more about her own insecurities and need for control. I documented her actions, kept notes of dates and interactions, but never retaliated overtly. In these moments, I discovered a strange, almost meditative strength. My morning routine, once simply a pastime, became a quiet rebellion, a declaration that peace, patience, and personal joy could not be dictated by someone else's whims. As the sun climbed higher and the warmth of the day began to disperse the morning chill, I sometimes glanced toward the houses lining the lake. Most neighbors were still asleep or engaged in their own routines, oblivious to the subtle tension brewing just beyond the tranquil waters. Corinne, of course, was vigilant, packing behind drawn curtains or peering from behind her hedges, ready to enforce her self-appointed mandate at a moment's notice. Yet in spite of her watchfulness, the lake retained its magic. It shimmered with light, reflected the colors of the sky, and whispered its timeless serenity. Each fish that tugged at my line, each duck that glided by, each child's laughter carried a message. Life could be beautiful and undisturbed, if only one had the patience and perspective to allow it. And so each morning, despite the knowledge that Corinne's disapproval lurked nearby, I continued my ritual. I watched, I listened, I cast my line, and I cherished the simple pleasures of a lakeside life that was mine to enjoy. In that quiet, shimmering space between sunrise and the start of the day, I felt the world's troubles recede, replaced by a profound and enduring sense of calm, the kind of peace that even the most determined adversary could not touch. The lake, in all its reflective glory, reminded me that some sanctuaries are inviolable, that serenity is an act of perseverance as much as a state of being, and that the true measure of one's strength is often found not in confrontation, but in the patient, unyielding preservation of one's own peace. The morning air carried a chill that hinted at the approaching change of seasons, and yet it was the note pinned to my door that sent the first true shiver down my spine. It was a small piece of paper, the type one might use for a casual reminder, yet the words scrawled in neat, precise handwriting conveyed a severity far beyond a simple message. Fishing is not allowed. Your activities disturb the community. Cease immediately. At first I stared at it in disbelief, a mixture of irritation and amusement bubbling up. I had lived here for years, fully aware of all HOA regulations, always careful to maintain my property, pay my dues, and respect my neighbors' spaces. My fishing trips were a long-standing part of my morning ritual, a quiet celebration of solitude, reflection, and the unhurried rhythm of nature. To be told now that I had somehow become a disturbance felt absurd, almost comical. I laughed quietly, tucking the note into my pocket more as a curiosity than a threat. I could have ignored it entirely, written it off as a petty attempt to assert control by someone obsessed with the minutiae of community standards. And yet, even as I tried to dismiss it, an undercurrent of unease began to stir, subtle but insistent, like a shadow stretching at the edge of my perception. That morning I carried my fishing rod to the dock as usual, the familiar creak of the wood underfoot offering comfort. The sky was soft with early light pastel hues reflecting in the water that had always been my refuge. But as I approached the shoreline, a strange, sour smell hit my nostrils, cutting through the freshness of the morning air. It was faint at first, barely perceptible but unmistakable, a chemical tang mixed with the rot of decay. I frowned, scanning the water. The surface, usually pristine and reflective, had taken on an unnatural sheen. Tiny ripples quivered along the edge, but something was wrong. Then I noticed the fish. Small ones first, floating belly up, their scales glinting unnaturally in the weak sunlight. Panic began to creep into my chest, sharp and insistent, as I realized this was not a minor disturbance but a full-blown disaster. Ducks that normally quacked and flitted across the water now sat silently, beady eyes fixed, unmoving, their feathers slicked and matted. The air around the lake had changed. What had been a sanctuary now felt tainted, and an oppressive heaviness hung over the familiar surroundings. I walked along the dock, eyes scanning for any clues. There were no obvious signs of pollution, no trash, no overturned boats, no oil slick, but the evidence was unmistakable. The life I had known here was dying, and I had no idea why. My mind raced, recalling every interaction with Karen, every disapproving glare, every note about community standards. Could this be related? It seemed impossible, almost absurd, yet I couldn't entirely dismiss the thought. My neighbors began to emerge, drawn by the smell and the unsettling quiet. Faces that were usually cheerful now held confusion and concern. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at the water. "Mom, why are the fish dead?" She had no answer, just a grim expression as she followed my gaze. The lake, which had once been a place of calm reflection, had transformed into a tableau of devastation. I pulled out my phone, calling the local environmental authorities, explaining what I had found. The woman on the other end sounded concerned but not alarmed, assuring me that someone would be sent to investigate. While I waited, I couldn't sit still. I examined the shoreline, stepping carefully among reeds and stones, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The smell seemed to intensify closer to the water's edge, a thick metallic stench that made my eyes water. Every step I took only confirmed my worst suspicions. This was not a natural occurrence. Something or someone had poisoned the lake. My thoughts immediately went back to the note, back to Karen, to her obsessive need for control. Could she have escalated from annoyance to outright sabotage? I tried to push the thought away, but it lingered like smoke, impossible to ignore. The air was heavy with tension as more neighbors gathered, murmuring among themselves, their faces pale. Someone suggested that perhaps a nearby factory or lawn treatment had contaminated the water, but nothing seemed likely. Our neighborhood was insulated from industrial hazards, and most residents were careful with fertilizers and chemicals. And yet the evidence was undeniable. The lake, the heart of our community, was under threat. I moved along the dock to the middle, kneeling and dipping my hand into the water. It was slick and oily, warm despite the morning chill, and the unnatural sheen clung to my skin. The sensation sent a shiver through me, a visceral confirmation of the danger that had invaded our sanctuary. I knew then that this was no ordinary complaint or petty rivalry. This was a deliberate act, a first strike meant to unsettle, to intimidate, and to assert dominance over something that was mine to enjoy. Panic and anger wrestled for control inside me, a storm of emotion that mirrored the rising sun behind me. I could no longer pretend this was merely an annoyance. This was a threat, and it had crossed a line. I retreated to the safety of my porch, observing the lake from a distance, noting every movement, every ripple, every hint of disturbance. The ducks had disappeared entirely, and the air was now heavy with the scent of decay. My neighbors were cautiously keeping their distance, unsure how to respond, while I tried to formulate a plan. I needed evidence, proof that this was intentional, proof that whoever had done this could be held accountable. The environmental authorities would take samples, test for chemicals, and investigate the source, but I knew from experience that such processes took time. Meanwhile, the damage was visible, undeniable, and personal. I thought of Karen, her disapproving glances, her notes, her obsession with image and community standards. Could she really have gone this far? It was a horrifying thought, yet I could not discount it entirely. The realization that someone could harbor such resentment, such determination to disrupt my life, was unsettling. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lake, I sat on the porch, staring at the water that had once been a mirror of tranquility. It now reflected a warning, a silent message that my peaceful existence was no longer guaranteed. I resolved to remain vigilant, to document everything, and to confront this threat with both caution and resolve. The lake, my haven, had been violated, and I understood with grim clarity that this was only the beginning. Whatever had been unleashed that morning, whatever had turned our sanctuary into a scene of death and silence, it was not accidental. It was deliberate, and the message was clear. My peace, my right to enjoy my property, was under attack. As darkness fell, the first stars appearing in the sky, I felt the full weight of what had transpired. The community that had once thrived in harmony now held a tremor of fear, an undercurrent of unease that threatened to spread. And I, standing at the center of it, understood that the days ahead would demand vigilance, cunning, and resilience. The first threat had arrived, quiet but undeniable, and it carried with it the promise of more challenges yet to come. I could not ignore it. I would not ignore it. The lake, my life, and the fragile peace of our neighborhood depended on it, and I swore silently that I would uncover the truth, confront the culprit, and restore the sanctuary that had been violated. Whatever it took, I would not allow fear or intimidation to claim what had long been my refuge. The first threat was only the beginning, but it had awakened in me a determination as sharp and unyielding as the morning sun, a resolve to protect what was rightfully mine. It started subtly, the way a storm begins with a single gust of wind before building into a hurricane. I had attended the HOA meetings for years, mostly out of a sense of civic duty, never expecting drama to touch my personal life. But in the days following the poisoning of the lake, I began to notice patterns in Corinne's behavior that were far from coincidental. She attended meetings with her usual air of authority, clipboard in hand, ready to assert her vision of order upon anyone who dared stray from her rigid definitions of propriety. Yet now, beneath that familiar posture, there was a flicker of triumph in her eyes, a subtle smirk when she thought no one was watching, as though she had already won some small, secret victory. I began to pay closer attention to her words, the phrasing of her reports, the casual remarks dropped like breadcrumbs into conversation. She spoke often of setting examples, of maintaining standards, and the occasional casual boast slipped through about how certain neighbors, unspecified of course, were learning their place. At first, it seemed like harmless arrogance, a natural byproduct of her self-appointed authority. But as I pieced together the timing of events, her presence near the lake the night before the first fish died, her sudden obsession with the image of our community, and the coincidence of chemical runoff mentioned in her casual HOA chatter, a chilling realization began to form. I recalled one particular meeting, held under the guise of discussing landscaping improvements. Corinne had leaned toward another board member, whispering in that calculated tone she reserved for confidential exchanges. "He thinks he can enjoy the lake without consequences," she had said. "We'll just teach him a lesson." At the time, the words seemed petty, perhaps a reference to my fishing or a light-hearted complaint. But now, with the lake poisoned and wildlife dying, the implication hit like a hammer. She had done it. She had intentionally introduced chemicals into the lake, believing it would frighten me into abandoning my morning routine. The arrogance, the complete disregard for the ripple effects of her actions, left me momentarily breathless. This wasn't just about me. The lake was the lifeblood of our community, supplying water for irrigation, supporting the local wildlife, and serving as a scenic focal point for every neighbor's backyard. By attempting to manipulate a personal annoyance into a spectacle of control, she had risked the health and safety of everyone around us. I spent that night packing my porch, the sounds of the neighborhood muted under the heavy shadow of dread. The lake, illuminated by moonlight, now seemed almost sinister, a mirror reflecting the consequences of human folly. I thought about the ducks that had vanished, the fish that had floated lifelessly near the surface, the subtle but insidious chemical sheen that lingered across the water's edge. It was one thing to be annoyed by someone's pastime. It was another to endanger an entire ecosystem, to play God with the lives of creatures who had no say in human disputes. Determined to understand the full extent of her actions, I began a methodical inquiry. I spoke quietly to neighbors who had interacted with Corinne in the days leading up to the incident. One mentioned that she had purchased special cleaning chemicals under the pretense of pond maintenance, although her explanations never made sense. Another noted she had lingered unusually near the lake after dark, claiming to check for nocturnal hazards, though none were apparent. Piece by piece, a damning picture emerged. Corinne's plot was deliberate, carefully disguised under layers of bureaucratic concern, and executed with the belief that she was justified in her actions. Her hubris was astounding. She bragged to others about teaching me a lesson, as if punishing me for enjoying my own property was a mark of courage or ingenuity. Yet she had no understanding of what she was tampering with, no appreciation for the delicate balance of life she threatened, and no foresight to predict the chain reaction her arrogance would unleash. That morning, I returned to the dock with a renewed sense of purpose. The lake shimmered under the soft, early light, deceptively calm after the chaos that had passed beneath its surface. The chemical sheen persisted, a tangible reminder of the violation, and the smell, though faint, lingered stubbornly in the air. I knelt and touched the water, wincing as the oily texture clung to my fingers. My mind raced with possibilities. How much damage had already been done? Could the fish population recover? Had the chemicals seeped into the irrigation systems that fed our gardens and lawns? Worse, had they reached the main water source that sustained the entire community? The more I considered it, the more urgent the situation became. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I contacted environmental specialists, detailing every observation, every strange interaction, every detail that hinted at deliberate contamination. They promised a swift investigation, sending technicians to collect samples, assess the chemical composition, and trace the source. While I waited, I did my own reconnaissance, noting patterns, documenting every abnormality along the shoreline, and recording the reactions of neighbors who had begun to notice the subtle but unmistakable effects of the contamination. Karen, of course, attended the next HOA meeting with her characteristic composure, though I caught glimpses of a shadow of impatience in her expression. She spoke of community standards, of maintaining order, of the importance of accountability, and yet the knowledge of her own guilt seemed almost invisible to her. To her, this was still a game, a minor skirmish in her ongoing war to assert control over our lives. But to me, it was a crisis, one that could not be treated lightly. I studied her closely, watching her every gesture, every flicker of emotion. It was astonishing how she maintained her facade, how easily she hid the reality of her actions from the board and from the community. And yet, despite her bravado, the consequences of her plot were already unfolding. The once thriving ecosystem of the lake had been disrupted, the delicate web of life destabilized, and the quiet trust that neighbors had placed in the safety of our shared environment fractured. I realized then that Karen's arrogance was not just a personal affront, it was a danger. She had acted without regard for law, ethics, or common sense, and the results were tangible, visible, and potentially disastrous. My heart sank as I stared at the water, recognizing that my fight was no longer just about fishing or property rights. It was about protecting life, safeguarding the community, and confronting a threat that had been both insidious and deliberate. I could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down, a heavy mantle I could not shrug off. The lake, in its deceptive calm, now demanded vigilance, strategy, and a clear understanding of the adversary I faced. Karen's secret plot had revealed not only her malice, but also the fragility of peace when confronted by unchecked ambition and ignorance. I knew that moving forward, I would need to gather evidence, prepare for confrontation, and ensure that this level of recklessness could never be repeated. The chemical sheen across the water's surface, the silent gaze of the vanished wildlife, and the quiet murmur of concerned neighbors all spoke of a truth I could no longer ignore. Karen's arrogance had escalated to a point where it threatened not just my enjoyment of the lake, but the very fabric of our community. I made a silent vow that day, staring into the murky depths of what had once been a mirror of serenity. This would not stand. The threat had been exposed, the plot uncovered, and now it was up to me to act. The first step was understanding, the second step was vigilance, and the third step would be decisive action. The consequences of inaction were too severe, the stakes far too high, and the arrogance of one woman could not be allowed to endanger the lives of so many. Karen's secret plot had been revealed, and with that revelation came the grim clarity that the battle for the lake, and for the safety of the entire community, was only beginning. I would confront it, piece by piece, with strategy, determination, and an unwavering commitment to protect what was mine and what belonged to all of us. The serene mornings of the past were gone, replaced by tension, suspicion, and the heavy responsibility of vigilance. But one thing was certain. I would not allow ignorance, arrogance, or malice to dictate the fate of the lake or the safety of the neighborhood. Karen had underestimated me, underestimated the consequences of her actions, and underestimated the resilience of those who truly valued life, peace, and justice. The plot had been unveiled, and now the response had begun. The moment I realized the true extent of the contamination, my chest tightened with a sense of urgency so acute it felt almost physical. I grabbed my phone and called the local water authority, explaining in rapid, clipped sentences what I had observed. The chemical sheen across the surface, the lifeless fish, the silent ducks, and the pungent, metallic odor that lingered in the air. I emphasized that this was not a localized incident confined to my dock, but something far larger, potentially affecting the entire community. The person on the other end listened patiently, asking precise questions about timing, visible wildlife casualties, and any unusual activity near the lake. Within the hour, specialists arrived in a fleet of vehicles, marked with the emblem of the city's Environmental Safety Division. They carried sampling equipment, protective gear, and devices that measured chemical concentration, all moving with an efficiency that contrasted sharply with the creeping panic settling over the neighborhood. I followed them to the edge of the water, explaining everything I had documented, noting the presence of children who had wandered too close, elderly neighbors who were curious but vulnerable, and the pets whose owners remained unaware of the looming danger. One technician, a tall man with a calm demeanor and a clipboard bristling with forms, knelt at the water's edge, scooping up samples in sterile containers while explaining the process in clipped, professional tones. He mentioned that preliminary tests suggested a mixture of toxins, chemicals not native to the environment, and the potential for rapid spread throughout the lake's ecosystem. My stomach churned as I processed the implications. If left untreated, the water would not only remain lethal to fish and wildlife but could infiltrate irrigation systems, seep into household water supplies, and pose a serious health risk to residents. I took careful note of the reactions around me. Neighbors began gathering at the edges of the lake, murmuring anxiously, whispering questions and theories. Some looked terrified, glancing nervously at the water while holding their children close. Others seemed angry, demanding answers from HOA members, who were desperately attempting to frame the situation as a minor mishap or an overreaction. Karen stood apart from the crowd, initially smug, her posture upright, arms crossed as though daring anyone to question her actions. But as the emergency crews moved systematically, setting up cordons, placing warning signs, and distributing protective instructions to residents, the smugness faded. Her confident expression wavered as she realized this was no longer a game, no longer a situation that could be brushed aside with a few pointed remarks at a meeting. The gravity of the situation was undeniable. The lake, once a shimmering mirror of calm and beauty, had transformed into a quarantined hazard, a visual testament to human negligence and malice. Yellow tape flapped in the morning breeze, marking the boundaries of the affected area, while large signs warned of contamination, instructing residents to keep children and pets away at all costs. Emergency responders moved swiftly, explaining that the chemical spread was accelerating due to water currents, making containment a race against time. Specialists began neutralization procedures, carefully calculating chemical balances to counteract the toxins, but every moment counted. I paced the edge of the lake, noting every detail, coordinating with neighbors who were willing to help, and observing Karen's reactions. At first, she tried to interject, offering unsolicited suggestions that reflected a deep misunderstanding of the science involved, but emergency personnel politely but firmly shut her down. Her attempts at maintaining authority were futile against the reality of the crisis. As hours passed, I realized that the danger was not abstract, it was immediate. Children who had been playing along safe areas of the shoreline were now moved back, elderly residents were urged to stay indoors, and pet owners scrambled to check their animals for signs of distress. The community, which had once taken for granted the serenity of the lake, now confronted the tangible consequences of negligence and malice. The specialists worked methodically, deploying containment booms, testing chemical concentrations at multiple points, and coordinating with municipal water services to ensure that none of the contaminated water entered public supply lines. Each step was precise, calculated, and necessary, yet I could feel the tension coiling tighter around the neighborhood. At one point, a neighbor approached me, trembling, holding a small dog wrapped in a blanket. "Do you think it's safe?" she asked, eyes wide with fear. I could only shake my head, directing her toward the authorities who had set up a temporary aid station, offering reassurances while maintaining strict quarantine zones. Karen, who had initially seemed untouchable in her self-assured demeanor, was now pale and jittery. Her usual confidence, built on intimidation and bureaucratic manipulation, had crumbled in the face of an undeniable emergency. She moved through the crowd nervously, attempting to appear helpful but faltering with every question posed about the chemical spread, the effect on wildlife, and the risk to residents. Her mistakes, trivial in the past, had now escalated into potential catastrophe, and the reality of consequences was settling in with a weight she had not anticipated. I observed all of this with a mix of relief and determination. Relief, because the authorities were competent and the emergency measures were in place. Determination, because I understood that the events of this day would not be forgotten. I meticulously documented the proceedings, recording the placement of cordons, the deployment of chemical neutralizers, and the reactions of all present, knowing that this evidence could be crucial for accountability. The sun climbed higher, and despite the initial panic, a rhythm of controlled urgency began to take hold. Emergency crews moved with precision, neighbors cooperated when instructed, and Karen's attempts to assert control became increasingly desperate and ineffective. It was a real-world confrontation between expertise and arrogance, and for the first time, the true scope of her recklessness was visible to everyone. I thought of the lake's wildlife, the fish that had perished, the ducks that had disappeared, and the delicate ecosystem that had been disrupted. Specialists reassured us that recovery was possible, but the timeline was uncertain, dependent on continued vigilance and careful remediation. I resolved then and there that no such incident would occur again under anyone's watch, particularly someone as dangerously overconfident as Karen. The hours stretched into afternoon, and slowly, the immediate danger began to recede. Signs of containment appeared, barriers held, chemical neutralizers were carefully applied, and monitoring devices indicated a stabilization of the toxic spread. The community, though shaken, began to breathe again, realizing that while the situation had been dire, coordinated response and expert intervention had prevented a full-blown disaster. Karen, on the other hand, was visibly diminished. Her previous aura of dominance was replaced with unease, her attempts at casual conversation or justification stymied by the very real consequences she had set into motion. The community's eyes, previously indifferent or mildly annoyed by her behavior, now regarded her with suspicion, anger, and a dawning recognition that her actions could have caused serious harm. As I watched the scene unfold from the safety of my porch, the lake glinting ominously under the midday sun, I understood that the race against time was far from over. The immediate danger had been mitigated, but vigilance would be necessary for weeks, perhaps months, as the ecosystem recovered and the water's safety was continually monitored. I felt a surge of resolve, knowing that complacency could no longer be an option. The lake, the community, and the fragile trust among neighbors had been tested, and while the authorities had stabilized the crisis, the underlying threat, the recklessness of someone like Karen, remained. I made a mental note to continue monitoring both the lake and her actions, understanding that true safety required attention, documentation, and the willingness to confront malice directly. The community had faced a tangible threat, and Karen's hubris had been laid bare. The lake, quarantined yet resilient, stood as a reminder that peace was precious and easily disrupted, that the consequences of unchecked arrogance could be catastrophic, and that vigilance, Swift action and the courage to challenge authority when necessary were essential for protecting the lives, health, and trust of those who called this neighborhood home. The first chapter of reckoning had begun, and though the immediate danger had been contained, the lessons of this day would resonate through every future encounter with Karen and anyone who believed that the tranquility of others could be manipulated without consequence. The investigation moved swiftly once the authorities took the situation seriously. Specialists collected samples, traced chemical residues, and cross-referenced purchase records, delivery receipts, and security camera footage. Within days, a damning pattern emerged, leaving no room for doubt. The poisoning of the lake had originated from Karen's property. When confronted, she attempted to weave a web of excuses, claiming that she only wanted to stop the fishing and that she didn't know it would be this bad. Her voice carried the same note of condescension she had used in HOA meetings, the same tone she believed would absolve her of responsibility. But the authorities had evidence, chemical traces matching her stored substances, witness statements noting her presence near the lake late at night, and even casual boasts she had let slip to other HOA members. Each piece of evidence fit together with chilling precision, forming an irrefutable chain that pointed directly to her. Fines were the first consequence, a series of escalating financial penalties designed to reflect the severity of the act, the potential threat to public safety, and the ecological damage inflicted. Karen's face turned pale as she was handed the citations, the weight of accountability beginning to replace the smug confidence she had previously worn. Her protests grew desperate, imploring for leniency, claiming she had no intention of causing harm, but intent mattered far less than the reality of the destruction she had caused. Neighbors who had once tolerated her overbearing nature now watched with a mixture of relief and schadenfreude, witnessing a reckoning long overdue. Lawsuits followed. Some residents had noticed the effects on their own property, the potential contamination of private wells, the distress caused to pets, and the anxiety inflicted on children who had played near the lake. Class action suits were drafted, lawyers consulted, and a formal legal process began to hold Karen accountable for the tangible consequences of her reckless behavior. In every meeting, every deposition, her defenses weakened, and the arrogance that had fueled her actions gave way to desperation. Public shamming accompanied the legal proceedings, amplified by HOA newsletters and community bulletins. Articles described the incident factually, detailing the chemical contamination, the near-health crisis, and the bravery of neighbors who had acted quickly to protect lives and property. Karen, once an imposing figure in HOA circles, became a cautionary tale, a living example of what happens when hubris overrides common sense and compassion. The HOA, facing both external scrutiny and internal moral obligation, had no choice but to strip her of all authority. She was formally banned from any community enforcement duties, prohibited from initiating complaints without board approval, and removed from committees where she had once wielded disproportionate power. This formal removal was accompanied by a clear message to the community. The well-being of residents and the environment would no longer be subject to the whims of an individual. While Karen faced these consequences, I focused on restoring what had been harmed. Working closely with water engineers and environmental specialists, we developed a detailed remediation plan to purify the lake, neutralize chemical residues, and restore its ecological balance. Pumps, aeration systems, and carefully measured neutralizing agents were deployed, and the work was methodical, precise, and exhausting. Every day I observed the progress, noting the gradual return of small fish, the cautious reappearance of ducks, and the slow clearing of the water's surface. Each change was a small victory, a testament to both human diligence and nature's resilience. My dock, once merely a personal retreat, gradually became a symbol of endurance and recovery. It bore witness to tragedy and triumph alike, a quiet monument to the restoration of peace, the resilience of a community, and the tangible results of vigilance and care. Friends and neighbors who had once joined me for casual mornings of fishing began to return, tentatively at first, testing the water's safety, observing the improvements, and sharing in the cautious optimism that slowly spread through the neighborhood. Children's laughter gradually returned to the shores, ducks resumed their quiet ballet, and the lake's reflective surface regained its familiar beauty. Karen, stripped of power and faced with legal and financial repercussions, retreated from public life within the community. The smugness that had once been her armor was gone, replaced by a quiet bitterness that neighbors could sense but no longer feared. Her attempts to assert influence were met with polite distance or firm refusal, a subtle but effective reinforcement of the boundaries she had crossed. Throughout this period, I maintained vigilance over the lake and the surrounding ecosystem. I coordinated with engineers, observed wildlife patterns, and documented every recovery milestone, understanding that restoration was both a process and a responsibility. The dock, now a place of reflection rather than mere recreation, stood as a reminder that peace and safety are not granted. They are earned through attention, diligence, and the courage to confront threats head-on. Looking across the water one morning, I reflected on the chain of events. A neighbor's arrogance had threatened life, disrupted a community, and endangered an entire ecosystem. Yet through careful intervention, accountability, and collaboration, balance had been restored. The lesson was stark but clear. Negligence, even when cloaked in authority or intention, carries consequences, and vigilance is the price of preserving both human and natural communities. Karen's fall from influence was complete. The neighborhood had witnessed a reckoning that combined justice, remediation, and restoration. In the months that followed, HOA meetings resumed with a renewed focus on transparency, safety, and accountability. Procedures were rewritten to prevent unilateral enforcement by any individual. The lake's recovery became a shared project, fostering a renewed sense of community and respect for the fragile balance between human enjoyment and ecological stewardship. As I sat on my dock one quiet morning, rod in hand, casting a line into the clear, sparkling water, I realized the dock now represented more than a place for fishing. It was a testament to resilience, to the triumph of foresight and diligence over recklessness, and to the quiet power of protecting what truly matters. The fish swam beneath the surface, ducks paddled gracefully across the calm water, and children's laughter drifted along the shore, a symphony of restored life. Karen's actions had left a scar, but the community's response had healed it. My dock, my lake, and my mornings had survived, and in that survival lay a lesson for everyone. Vigilance, courage, and accountability are the pillars that uphold peace, and no individual, regardless of arrogance or position, can dismantle what is nurtured with care, integrity, and resilience. The events surrounding the lake had left a lasting imprint on the community, one that went far beyond the immediate shock of chemical contamination or the tangible consequences that Karen faced. In the weeks and months following the incident, the neighborhood was forced to confront not just the physical ramifications but the social and ethical ones as well. The first lesson, which quickly became evident to everyone, was that self-appointed justice can backfire catastrophically. Karen had believed that by taking matters into her own hands, she could assert control, maintain order, and teach a lesson to a neighbor who dared to enjoy the simple pleasures of fishing. In her mind, she was enforcing standards, protecting the image of the community, and demonstrating authority. In reality, her unilateral actions had nearly caused a disaster of epic proportions. The chemical contamination, the death of wildlife, the threat to children, pets, and elderly residents, and the near collapse of trust within the neighborhood, all these consequences traced back directly to her hubris. Residents began to understand that no single individual, regardless of their intentions or confidence, could wield absolute power over a community without oversight or accountability. Karen's downfall became a case study in the dangers of unchecked ego masquerading as responsibility. The second lesson was equally stark. Ignoring facts and rushing to punish someone is dangerous. Initially, Some HOA members had been quick to dismiss the severity of the lake contamination, trying to downplay the incident, framing it as a minor mishap, or suggesting that the authorities' presence was an overreaction. Others questioned my actions, speculating whether my complaints were exaggerated or motivated by personal grievances. That initial hesitation, born from a desire to avoid confrontation or preserve appearances, highlighted a universal truth. When facts are ignored, when assumptions replace investigation, and when decisions are rushed or biased, the consequences can be disastrous. By contrast, the measured, evidence-based approach of the authorities and the environmental specialists prevented an even greater catastrophe. Sampling the water, analyzing chemical compositions, tracing sources, and implementing scientifically sound neutralization strategies demonstrated the importance of expertise, patience, and respect for objective reality. The community witnessed firsthand the difference between impulsive judgment and informed action, and it was a lesson that resonated deeply, shaping discussions in meetings long after the immediate crisis had passed. The third lesson, intertwined with the others, concerned the true nature of leadership. Karen had believed that authority was synonymous with power, that control could be asserted through intimidation, fear, or self-proclaimed competence. Yet the events at the lake revealed that true leadership is built on knowledge, responsibility, and foresight, not ego. Real leaders anticipate consequences, consult experts, weigh evidence, and act in the collective interest rather than their own sense of self-importance. The water engineers, environmental specialists, emergency responders, and even residents who collaborated to restore the lake embodied these qualities. Their methodical, thoughtful approach contrasted sharply with Karen's reckless assumptions, and the outcome reflected that contrast. Leadership, the community realized, was not a title on a clipboard or a position on a board. It was the ability to make informed decisions that protect others and nurture the environment. In practical terms, the HOA enacted new protocols designed to prevent a recurrence of unilateral decision-making. No member could act independently in matters affecting the community or its natural resources. All complaints and interventions now required documentation, verification, and oversight, ensuring that personal vendettas or unfounded suspicions could not translate into dangerous actions. Signage was placed around the lake emphasizing its status as a protected area, with clear guidance for children, pets, and residents on safe interactions. Educational sessions were held, led by the environmental specialists, explaining how the lake ecosystem functioned, why chemicals could cause irreversible damage, and the role each resident played in maintaining safety and harmony. Karen herself was permanently barred from any activity involving the lake. She could no longer attend meetings relating to environmental oversight, water management, or community safety. Her removal was both symbolic and practical, a message that recklessness and hubris have consequences, and a preventative measure to ensure the safety of residents and wildlife alike. Slowly, life returned to a new normal. Children cautiously returned to the shoreline, laughing as they skipped stones, built sandcastles, and dipped toes into the clean water. Families gathered for picnics and morning fishing sessions, the quiet serenity of the lake once again a backdrop for community bonding rather than tension and fear. Ducks paddled across the surface, their quacks a comforting melody that had been absent for too long. Fish, slowly replenished through careful intervention and natural reproduction, darted beneath the water's surface, a tangible sign that balance had been restored. I returned to my dock each morning, rod in hand, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment and responsibility. My time on the water was no longer just a personal ritual. It was a testament to resilience, recovery, and the lessons learned through adversity. Watching the sunrise reflect across the restored lake, I felt the interconnectedness of the community, the environment, and the choices we make. The lake had become more than just my property. It was the lifeblood of the neighborhood, a shared treasure that required vigilance, cooperation, and respect. Conversations among neighbors changed as well. Where gossip and suspicion had once simmered, There was now discussion, education, and caution. Children were taught to respect the water, to understand its role in the ecosystem, and to recognize that safety depends on the responsibility of every individual. Parents felt a renewed sense of confidence, knowing that procedures were in place, safeguards enforced, and lessons of accountability internalized. Even the casual observers, those who once looked at the lake as merely a scenic view, began to recognize its importance and the fragility of balance that sustained it. In my own reflection, I recognized the subtle transformation that had occurred within me. The incident had tested my patience, my observation, and my commitment to community well-being. It had forced me to act decisively, communicate effectively with authorities, and participate actively in remediation. My dock, once merely a personal retreat for fishing, now represented something deeper, a symbol of stewardship, resilience, and the responsibility each of us bears in safeguarding the collective good. The broader message resonated. A community is only as strong as its commitment to shared values, informed decision-making, and vigilance against unchecked ego or malice. Karen's actions, though destructive, had inadvertently strengthened the community's understanding of accountability, the importance of science-based action, and the necessity of cooperative leadership. Even as she faded from public view, her legacy lingered as a cautionary tale, a reminder that arrogance and impulsiveness can threaten the very foundations of shared life. The restored lake became a central point for teaching these lessons. HOA meetings incorporated environmental education, youth programs highlighted ecological stewardship, and neighbors regularly checked in on the water's condition, ensuring that complacency never again put the community at risk. My mornings on the dock became quiet, reflective sessions not just of fishing, but of gratitude for the lessons learned, for the safety regained, and for the harmonious life that had been restored through collective effort. Slowly, the sense of vigilance became second nature, the awareness that tranquility is fragile, and that every resident plays a role in maintaining it, from the smallest child tossing a pebble to the adults monitoring community health and environmental safety. The lake, in all its reflective glory, had transformed into a living classroom, a hub of resilience, and a reminder that peace, safety, and harmony require active engagement, informed judgment, and a willingness to stand against recklessness when it threatens the community. By the time the season changed, the water had fully recovered, wildlife returned, and families resumed their daily routines without fear. Karen remained a peripheral figure, her presence no longer tolerated in matters concerning safety or the lake, and her fall from influence served as a quiet but persistent warning that ego without accountability has consequences. In the end, the neighborhood emerged stronger, wiser, and more unified. The three lessons: self-appointed justice can backfire, ignoring facts is dangerous, and true leadership comes with knowledge, became embedded in the communal consciousness, guiding decisions, interactions, and policies for years to come. As I sat on my dock one morning, the water calm and glistening under the rising sun, children laughing in the distance, and ducks gliding across the surface, I understood the full meaning of stewardship. The lake was no longer mine alone. It belonged to the entire community, a shared lifeblood that demanded respect, vigilance, and collaboration. Peace had been restored, but the lessons endured, ensuring that the neighborhood would remain a place of safety, enjoyment, and shared responsibility for generations to come. Months had passed since the poisoning incident, yet the memory of that dark period lingered like a shadow beneath the surface of our everyday lives. The lake, once tainted by chemicals and fear, had recovered fully, its waters shimmering with a clarity that seemed almost miraculous. The fish had returned, glinting beneath the surface in schools that moved like liquid silver, while ducks paddled leisurely, quacking softly as if nothing had ever disturbed their routine. The sun rose over the water each morning, painting the sky in the familiar hues of amber and rose, and I felt a quiet gratitude for the resilience of nature, a reminder that life has a remarkable capacity to heal if given the chance and protection. My own mornings on the dock resumed their previous rhythm, the gentle slap of waves against the wood, the rhythmic sway of my fishing line, and the quiet anticipation of a tug beneath the surface providing comfort and continuity. But the solitude that had once defined my routine had subtly transformed. Neighbors, who had once merely observed from a distance or passed with polite nods, now began joining me. Children would creep to the edge of the dock with shy curiosity, asking to see the fish or to help untangle a line, while parents lingered nearby, sharing stories, jokes, and memories. Laughter became a soundtrack that blended with the natural sounds of the lake, the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze, the croak of frogs, and the distant call of birds returning to their perches. The dock, once my solitary refuge, had become a gathering place, a symbol of shared peace, resilience, and cautious optimism. The sense of community, once threatened by fear and malice, had strengthened in the aftermath of crisis. Neighbors now communicated openly, checking in with one another about the lake's condition, discussing maintenance, and educating children about ecological responsibility. Safety protocols were reviewed and refined, with clear guidelines about who could handle the lake's resources, how water quality would be monitored, and what steps to take if any unusual activity occurred. In this renewed environment, even small acts became meaningful. A neighbor helping another with a fishing line, someone sharing fresh-baked bread during morning coffee, the collective effort to keep the lake clean and safe, all reinforced the sense that our community was not just a collection of houses, but a network of individuals committed to mutual care and stewardship. Karen, the would-be villain who had caused so much fear and chaos, had faded into infamy, her presence now mostly a whisper in conversation, a cautionary tale told during HOA meetings. Residents recounted her reckless arrogance, her misguided attempts at self-appointed justice, and the near catastrophe she had triggered, all in hushed tones or with wry smiles. Her fall from authority had been complete. She no longer held any official power, was barred from community enforcement roles, and had become a symbol of what happens when ego overrides responsibility. Even when she occasionally appeared near the periphery of the neighborhood, her attempts to assert influence were met with polite distance, disinterest, or quiet disapproval. The lesson was clear. Authority comes with responsibility, and reckless action, no matter how well-intentioned it may seem, carries consequences. In contrast, the residents who had acted with vigilance, foresight, and cooperation were celebrated, not with pomp or ceremony, but through the renewed trust, camaraderie, and shared enjoyment of the lake. Over time, this subtle recognition fostered a culture of respect and proactive engagement. The HOA meetings became forums for constructive discussion rather than arenas of tension and mistrust. Topics ranged from environmental stewardship to community events, from educational programs for children to the maintenance of shared spaces, and the tone was collaborative, informed, and measured. The lake itself had become a living emblem of resilience. Its sparkling waters reflected the sunlight in a way that seemed to say, "We survived, and so can we endure anything." I often watched children learning to fish, couples taking quiet boat rides, and neighbors exchanging smiles along the shoreline. Each interaction reinforced the understanding that a community's strength lies not in the absence of conflict, but in the capacity to respond wisely, act responsibly, and heal collectively. Personally, I found my connection to the lake deepening in unexpected ways. Fishing was no longer merely a pastime or a quiet escape. It had become a lens through which I observed the rhythms of life, the interplay of nature and humanity, and the enduring power of vigilance, empathy, and perseverance. I taught the children not just how to bait a hook or untangle a line, but also about patience, respect for living creatures, and the importance of caring for shared resources. These mornings were filled with storytelling, lessons about responsibility, and laughter that rose above the soft lapping of the water. Each day reinforced the knowledge that peace is fragile but attainable, that mistakes and malice can have serious consequences, and that recovery, though challenging, is possible when people act together with integrity and care. Even the wildlife seemed to respond to this renewed harmony. Ducks nested along the shores with confidence, fish fed closer to the surface, and frogs croaked in rhythmic patterns that signaled stability. The lake, once a site of disruption and fear, had reclaimed its role as the heartbeat of the community, sustaining life, offering joy, and providing a setting for human connection that was both gentle and enduring. I noticed small rituals emerging organically among residents: morning greetings on the dock, shared coffee mugs, informal competitions to catch the biggest fish, storytelling sessions with children about the adventures of local wildlife, and quiet moments of reflection by the water's edge. These rituals, simple as they were, reinforced a sense of ownership and stewardship that transcended individual property lines, creating a collective identity centered on care, respect, and enjoyment of the natural environment. Karen, meanwhile, became a peripheral figure in these narratives. Her story, once immediate and frightening, had shifted into legend, an example of what happens when ego and recklessness override reason and responsibility. Adults shared her story with new residents, emphasizing the lessons learned and the importance of vigilance, while children absorbed the moral without the personal fear that had marked the initial crisis. Life continued in its gentle, measured rhythms. Mornings were marked by the subtle creak of the dock, the splash of fish, and the calls of birds. Afternoons brought sun-dappled reflections, quiet conversations among neighbors, and the occasional picnic by the water. Evenings offered a soft, golden glow across the lake, where families gathered to watch the sunset, recounting the day's adventures and savoring the simplicity of time spent together. I often sat on my dock, rod in hand, watching these interactions unfold, reflecting on how far we had come. The calm after the storm was not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding, cooperation, and shared responsibility. It was a state that required ongoing attention, care, and respect, yet it was deeply rewarding. My role, once solitary and focused on personal enjoyment, had evolved into one of quiet stewardship. I remained vigilant, ensuring that the lake was safe, that wildlife thrived, and that residents could continue to enjoy the space without fear. But I also shared in the communal joy, the laughter, and the stories that now defined mornings by the water. In these moments, I understood that the lake was no longer simply mine to enjoy. It was a symbol of collective resilience, a testament to the power of vigilance and cooperation, and a reminder that communities endure not through isolation, but through shared care, respect, and attention. The scars of the past remained, subtle but instructive. The memory of the contamination, the near disaster, and Karen's recklessness served as permanent markers of what could go wrong if ego, negligence, and malice were left unchecked. Yet they also reinforced the strength of proactive, informed action. Residents who once ignored small concerns now communicated openly, consulted experts when necessary, and participated actively in maintaining the health of the lake and the neighborhood. Over time, this culture became second nature, embedded into the rhythm of daily life, and extending to every corner of the community. The lake, reflecting the morning sun, now mirrored not fear but hope, resilience, and continuity. The dock, worn slightly from years of use but solid and dependable, bore witness to laughter, learning, and the gentle routines of a thriving neighborhood. Fishing became a shared activity, a way to connect across generations, and a tangible expression of the restored harmony that had been so nearly shattered. Karen's absence was a quiet relief, her name a whispered cautionary tale, while the lake and the community flourished. Every morning, as I cast my line into the clear water, I felt a profound sense of contentment. The calm after the storm was real, tangible, and hard-earned. Our community spirit, tested and strengthened through adversity, endured as a living, breathing testament to vigilance, responsibility, and the enduring power of shared care. The lake had survived, the wildlife had returned, and the people had grown wiser, kinder, and more united. In that continuity of life and laughter, I found reassurance. Peace is fragile, but with vigilance, knowledge, and community, it can not only endure but thrive.